When you think of Henry VIII's children, your mind likely conjures the stark images of Bloody Mary, heretics burning at the stake, or the resplendent Gloriana, Elizabeth I, presiding over a golden age. But lurking in the shadows of these iconic figures is a far more unsettling story, that of Edward VI, the boy king. His brief, tragic reign and the horrifying manner of his death peel back the veneer of Tudor grandeur to reveal a chilling narrative of innocence lost and fanaticism cultivated. This isn't merely the tale of a young monarch dying before his time. It's an exploration of how a child, coddled, isolated, and relentlessly indoctrinated, could transform into a figure whose burgeoning tyranny and ultimate demise would send shivers down the spine of a kingdom already hardened by his father's brutal rule. The story of Edward VI is a stark reminder that the most fertile ground for extremism can sometimes be found in the most protected, most cherished of gardens, especially when watered with the potent cocktail of absolute power and unwavering religious zeal. The year 1537 was one of delirious celebration across England. After decades of dynastic anxiety, 2 discarded queens, and a seismic break with the Roman Catholic Church, Henry VIII finally possessed the one thing he craved above all else: a legitimate male heir. The birth of Prince Edward was hailed as a divine blessing, a guarantee of stability for the Tudor line, but this joyous arrival was irrevocably tainted by tragedy. Just 12 days after delivering the longed-for son, Queen Jane Seymour succumbed to puerperal fever, leaving the infant prince motherless. This devastating loss only intensified Henry's already obsessive focus on his son. Edward was not just a prince, he was a miraculous survivor, the precious singular hope for England's future. And his father, a man increasingly consumed by paranoia and ill health, would ensure that nothing and no one could ever threaten his prize. From his very first breath, Edward was swaddled not just in silks and ermine, but in an overwhelming cocoon of expectation and adulation. He was England's nascent saviour, a status that precluded any semblance of a normal childhood. Unlike his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had both tasted the bitter sting of their father's displeasure, experiencing periods of illegitimacy, neglect, and even outright fear for their lives, Edward knew only a world of unwavering praise and indulgence. Henry VIII, perhaps burdened by guilt over his treatment of his daughters, or simply pouring all his dynastic ambitions into this single vessel, lavished upon his son an affection that bordered on worship. The young prince was constantly surrounded by a phalanx of guards, tutors, and fawning courtiers, each interaction reinforcing his unique, divinely ordained destiny. This gilded cage, designed to protect him, also profoundly isolated him, severing him from the everyday experiences that forge empathy and understanding in a developing mind. He was taught that he was special, chosen by God. And this lesson, learned in the impressionable crucible of early childhood, would have profound and terrifying consequences. The foundation was being laid, not for a benevolent ruler, but for a mind that would brook no dissent. Convinced of its own infallible righteousness, the education Henry VIII orchestrated for his heir was unlike any other royal upbringing. It was less about cultivating a well-rounded individual and more about forging a perfect weapon for the ongoing religious revolution. The king, having declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, was determined that his son would cement this Protestant future. To this end, he selected tutors who were not merely accomplished scholars, but men of fervent, even radical Protestant convictions. Figures like Richard Cox, John Check, and even Archbishop Thomas Cranmer himself were tasked with moulding the young prince's mind. From the tender age of 6, Edward was immersed in a rigorous curriculum. While he diligently studied Latin, Greek, French, and philosophy, these classical subjects were invariably filtered through the lens of militant Protestant theology. He wasn't just learning about ancient Rome. He was learning to see the Pope as the Antichrist. He wasn't just studying logic. He was being drilled in intricate theological arguments, proving the idolatry of Catholic practices and the absolute God-given authority of a Protestant monarch. This relentless indoctrination was astonishingly effective. By the age of 8, young Edward was not merely reciting his lessons. He was passionately debating complex theological points, capable of delivering learned discourses on the evils of Catholicism and the divine imperative for its eradication. His tutors marveled at his intellectual precocity, his quick grasp of abstruse doctrine. But this intellectual flowering was occurring in an emotional desert. While his mind was being sharpened into a formidable theological weapon, his capacity for human empathy, for understanding perspectives different from his own, was left to wither. He had no peers to challenge him, no ordinary children to play with, no experiences to teach him the common touch or the value of compassion. His world consisted of adults who deferred to his every utterance, who praised his every pronouncement, reinforcing the notion that his views, shaped by his extremist tutors, were not just correct, but divinely inspired. The boy who could dissect the arguments of Augustine or rail against transubstantiation had little to no concept of the human cost of the religious strife he was being groomed to perpetuate. He was being meticulously crafted into the perfect Protestant king, but in the process the boy himself was being lost, replaced by an unnervingly self-assured ideologue, a child who believed with every fibre of his being that any opposition to his future rule or his religious convictions was an affront to God himself. The stage was being set for a reign, where youthful conviction, untempered by worldly experience or human compassion, would unleash a darkness few could have anticipated. In the bleak January of 1547, the formidable reign of Henry VIII came to its end, and a 9-year-old boy, Edward VI, ascended to the English throne. He inherited not just a crown and scepter, but a kingdom precariously balanced on the knife edge of religious revolution. The country was a volatile mosaic of deeply entrenched Catholic traditions, burgeoning Protestant fervour, and a vast, uncertain middle ground, while a regency council, headed by his maternal uncle, Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, was established to govern in his name. It rapidly became clear that this was no passive child monarch. The seeds of fanaticism, so meticulously sown by his tutors, were already beginning to sprout with unnerving vigour. Edward, imbued with an unshakable belief in his divine right and his God-given mission to purify England, was not content to be a mere figurehead. From his earliest council meetings, the boy king stunned seasoned statesmen with his precocious and often chilling assertiveness. He would interrupt experienced advisers, men who had served his formidable father, to lecture them with surprising fluency on intricate points of Protestant doctrine, his pronouncements delivered with an air of absolute unchallengeable authority. It was a disquieting fusion of childish petulance and coldly articulate zeal, a combination that would soon cast a long, dark shadow over his realm. What particularly alarmed contemporary observers, though often whispered in hushed tones, was the young king's burgeoning fascination with the punitive aspects of his new role. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward began to take a keen and personal interest in the judicial process, particularly in cases involving heresy or treason. Court records from this nascent period of his reign reveal a child who seemed to treat matters of life and death as intellectual exercises rather than grave human tragedies. He would meticulously review death sentences, engaging his counselors in debates not about mercy or justice, but about the theological justifications for various punishments. Witnesses reported an unsettling detail. The young king would often exhibit a faint, almost imperceptible smile when signing death warrants, particularly those for individuals he deemed unrepentant heretics, seemingly pleased with his own cleverness in articulating the scriptural basis for their condemnation. These were not the actions of a bewildered child thrust into power, but rather the calculated decisions of a mind already convinced of its own infallibility and divinely sanctioned right to judge. The boy king's early months were punctuated by what courtiers discreetly termed his religious tantrums. Any suggestion of moderation in religious policy, any hint of compromise with lingering Catholic practices, could provoke explosive fits of rage. When an advisor, perhaps hoping to placate influential Catholic nobles, suggested allowing them to continue private worship, Edward reportedly hurled his silver inkwell across the chamber, his childish voice shrill with fury as he screamed that God would surely punish England for such craven weakness. These incidents, initially dismissed by some as mere immaturity, were in fact stark indicators of a burgeoning religious fanaticism, a dangerous inflexibility that saw the world in stark black and white, with no room for nuance or compassion. Perhaps most disturbing to those in his immediate circle was Edward's almost complete lack of conventional, childish interests. While other boys his age might have played with toy soldiers, chased hounds in the palace gardens, or revelled in tales of chivalry, Edward's leisure hours were often spent in more macabre pursuits. He developed an insatiable curiosity for accounts of religious persecution, particularly the workings of the Spanish Inquisition. He would spend hours poring over detailed descriptions of interrogation techniques, his brow furrowed in concentration, taking copious notes in his remarkably neat script. His personal servants, with growing unease, reported finding disturbing sketches in his private chambers, crude yet detailed drawings of various instruments of torture, the rack, the thumbscrew, the Iron Maiden, often annotated with Edward's own boyish scrawl, commenting on their perceived effectiveness for extracting confessions from recalcitrant heretics. The boy who should have been mastering the joust or learning the intricacies of courtly dance was instead meticulously studying the most efficient ways to break human bodies and spirits in the service of his rigid Protestant vision. His intellect, so lauded by his tutors, was being applied to the systematization of cruelty, a chilling marriage of youthful curiosity and brutal intent. The England he envisioned was not merely Protestant. It was to be purged, sanitized, and utterly subservient to his interpretation of God's will. This combination of religious fanaticism and absolute royal authority proved to be a lethal brew. While his advisors plotted and maneuvered for political advantage in the complex world of the Regency, the boy king absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with a terrifying literal enthusiasm. He maintained detailed personal journals throughout his reign, and these documents, preserved to this day, offer a chilling window into his developing psyche. They reveal a child who not only recorded political events, but also seemed to delight in lurid descriptions of executions, religious persecutions, and the palpable suffering of those he categorized as enemies of God. By the age of 10, Edward was not just passively consuming extremist ideology, he was actively producing it, personally composing sermons that were then disseminated and delivered in churches across England. These were not gentle homilies, but fiery diatribes, calling for the complete and utter elimination of all Catholic influence, promising divine retribution for any who dared show mercy to papists, and extolling the virtues of unwavering, militant Protestantism. His cruelty, however, was not solely reserved for matters of faith. Edward demonstrated a vindictive streak that shocked even those hardened courtiers who had navigated the treacherous currents of Henry VIII's brutal court. When servants displeased him, even in minor ways, Edward would devise elaborate and often humiliating punishments. One unfortunate page, who accidentally spilled wine on some of the king's theological papers, was forced, by Edward's direct and specific command, to stand in the public courtyard for several hours while other courtiers, under royal instruction, threw rotten fruit and refuse at him. The 11-year-old king watched this spectacle from a palace window, reportedly with an expression of keen interest, occasionally making notes as if observing a particularly fascinating, if unpleasant, scientific experiment on human degradation. His journal entries from this period reflect a mind becoming increasingly detached from normal human emotion, describing the suffering of others with the same dispassionate, clinical tone he might use to describe the weather, noting details of pain and fear as interesting observations rather than human tragedies. When a young kitchen maid, accused by an informant of secretly practicing Catholic prayers, died after a severe flogging ordered by the King's Council, an order Edward personally reviewed and approved, the young monarch's only recorded comment in his journal was to note that the correction proved more effective than anticipated in removing the subject from further error. A chillingly bureaucratic euphemism for a brutal death. Edward's treatment of his own family provided perhaps the clearest and most unnerving indication of his growing sociopathy. Despite having spent parts of his early childhood alongside his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, once he ascended the throne, any semblance of natural sibling affection evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment based purely on their religious utility to his grand design. Mary, a devout and unwavering Catholic, was viewed not as a sister, but as a dangerous impediment, a festering boil on the body politic that needed to be controlled, cowed, or ultimately eliminated. Elizabeth, with her carefully cultivated Protestant leanings, was marginally more acceptable, seen as a potential, though still suspect, ally in his religious crusade. For Edward, family relationships were stripped of all emotional content, becoming purely political and theological calculations. This became terrifyingly apparent during the downfall of his own uncle, Thomas Seymour, Lord High Admiral. Seymour, ambitious and perhaps reckless, had attempted to curry favor and gain influence over the young king through gifts, flattery, and a somewhat avuncular familiarity. Rather than being swayed by this apparent kindness or displaying any boyish affection for a man who had shown him attention, Edward perceived Thomas's overtures as cynical attempts at manipulation. When Seymour was arrested on charges of treason, charges many historians believe were inflated by his political rivals, including his own brother, the Lord Protector, Edward displayed not a flicker of familial loyalty or childish distress. He not only supported his uncle's condemnation and execution, but, according to several contemporary accounts, watched with unnerving composure from a palace window as the man who had once bounced him on his knee was dragged to Tower Hill and beheaded. Witnesses reported that the boy king showed no discernible emotion as the axe fell. Instead, he was later observed making detailed notes in his journal, not about the tragedy of his uncle's death, but about the crowd's reaction and the perceived efficiency of different execution methods discussed by his council. The boy was learning, not about mercy or grief, but about the mechanics of absolute power and the finality of state-sanctioned death. The innocent child, if he ever truly existed, was rapidly receding, replaced by a precocious, cold-blooded ideologue, convinced of his divine mission and increasingly comfortable with the brutal realities of its enforcement. As Edward VI transitioned from childhood into his early teens, the authoritarian tendencies that had disquieted his court solidified into a chillingly systematic approach to governance. The boy who had once seemed frail and bookish, more scholar than sovereign, began to assert an increasingly direct and uncompromising control over government policy. He grew impatient with the caution of his Regency Council, frequently overruling his advisors, particularly when he perceived their counsel as too lenient or politically expedient, especially concerning religious matters. His Protestant reforms, already stringent, became progressively more draconian. The Act of Uniformity, which had mandated the Book of Common Prayer, was enforced with a new ruthless vigor. Mandatory church attendance was monitored by an expanding network of informants, parish spies essentially, and severe penalties, ranging from hefty fines to imprisonment and public shaming, were meted out for any deviation from the prescribed forms of worship. Edward personally reviewed reports from across the kingdom, often expressing dissatisfaction with what he deemed insufficient zeal on the part of local magistrates in rooting out popish superstition. He envisioned an England not just nominally Protestant, but uniformly and fervently so, a spiritual monolith cleansed of all dissenting thought. The young king, now entering his 12th and 13th years, took a disturbingly personal hand in designing what amounted to a system of religious surveillance that would have earned the grudging admiration of the most zealous inquisitor. Neighbors were actively encouraged, even incentivized with rewards, to spy on one another, to report any whispered Catholic prayer, any hidden rosary, any sentimental attachment to the old rites. Children were praised, sometimes even brought before the king himself for reporting their parents' religious transgressions. Edward's court, once a centre of Renaissance learning and Henrician magnificence, transformed into a place where paranoia was a virtue, and fanaticism was the surest path to royal favour. Mercy, in this climate, was increasingly seen not as a Christian virtue, but as a sign of spiritual weakness, a dangerous indulgence of error. The king's obsession with control permeated every facet of English religious life. He issued a torrent of detailed regulations, proclamations, and injunctions, governing not just public worship in the parish churches, but also private devotions within the home. These decrees dictated with minute precision exactly how his subjects should pray, what specific theological tenets they must believe, and even how they should internally conceive of God. Violation of these intimately prescriptive regulations was treated not merely as a religious error, but as an act of treason against both the crown and the Almighty, with punishments escalating in severity from public humiliation and ruinous fines to brutal imprisonment, agonizing torture, and ultimately agonizing death. Edward, with a diligence that belied his youth, insisted on reviewing the records of nearly every significant case of heresy, often intervening to increase the recommended punishments, scribbling marginalia on court documents berating judges for their lack of godly rigor or their failure to comprehend the true gravity of the offense. The machinery of persecution that Edward and his council, particularly under the increasingly influential John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who supplanted Somerset as the leading figure in government, created, was remarkable for its systematic nature and the king's chillingly intimate involvement in its operation. Unlike adult rulers who might delegate the grim particulars of suppression to subordinates, Edward insisted on immersing himself in the details. He studied the particulars of each accused person's alleged crimes, the possession of a Latin Bible, the lighting of a votive candle, the questioning of a Protestant sermon. He would then often devise specific, almost theatrically cruel punishments he felt were symbolically appropriate to their particular theological errors. His journals from this period read less like a monarch's diary and more like a macabre manual for religious persecution, filled with detailed discussions on the relative efficacy of different punishments for various strains of heresy, and dispassionate observations on the comportment of the condemned. What made Edward's persecution particularly chilling was the way he combined an almost childish, inventive cruelty with deadly serious, state-sanctioned intent. When traditional punishments like burning or hanging seemed, in his view, insufficient. To convey the full horror of the heresy, the teenage king would personally devise new forms of public humiliation and prolonged suffering, always meticulously justified by elaborate, if twisted, theological arguments. One elderly Catholic priest, who steadfastly refused to renounce his faith despite repeated interrogations, was, by Edward's specific and detailed order, forced to carry a large, crudely painted sign reading "Christ's enemy and a deceiver of the people," while being paraded through the jeering streets of London, with children, encouraged by officials, pelting him with stones and offal. Edward, it was reported, watched this grotesque spectacle from a palace window, not with sorrow or even grim satisfaction, but with a detached, almost scientific interest, reportedly laughing at some of the priest's more pathetic attempts to shield himself, all the while dictating observations on the crowd's fervour to a secretary. The king's obsession with religious purity and his corresponding lack of natural human affection extended with brutal clarity to his own family. His half-sister Mary, the staunchly Catholic heir presumptive, became the focal point of his most intense ire. Edward viewed her not as a sibling, bound by blood and shared, if difficult, childhood experiences, but as the single greatest existential threat to his Protestant England. In private letters and journal entries that have survived the centuries, Edward wrote about Mary with a venom that was both profoundly childish in its emotional intensity and chillingly adult in its calculated malice. He referred to her as that bastard, Jezebel, and Christ's declared enemy, spending countless hours plotting intricate ways to have her declared illegitimate once more, to strip her of her titles, to break her will, or even, it is whispered in some contemporary sources, to arrange for her permanent removal through execution for heresy. The boy, who should have felt some vestige of brotherly concern, even if politically opposed, instead seemed to harbour dark fantasies of seeing his own sister burn at the stake, a sacrifice he apparently believed would please his version of God. This hatred of Mary went far beyond mere political calculation or dynastic expediency. It seemed to consume him with a personal, almost visceral intensity that deeply worried even his most radical Protestant advisers, who, while desiring Mary's neutralization, were perhaps unnerved by the sheer, unadulterated loathing emanating from their young sovereign. The king spent hours closeted with Protestant lawyers and theologians, men all too willing to find pliable legal and scriptural justifications for what amounted to a religiously motivated plan for sororicide. Court observers noted that Edward's mood would visibly darken whenever Mary's name was mentioned in his presence. He would often fall into sullen silences or retreat to his chambers to pen long, rambling screeds on the theological necessity of purging England of her contaminating influence. Edward's elaborate and cruel plans for dealing with Mary became increasingly detailed as he grew older and, ironically, as his own health began to falter. He drafted, in his own hand, meticulous scenarios for Mary's arrest, her show trial, and her eventual execution, complete with pre-written charges of high treason and aggravated heresy. He even, with a truly unsettling flourish, composed what he intended to be Mary's confession, a document designed to be extracted under duress, in which she would be forced to renounce her Catholic faith, acknowledge her own illegitimate birth, and beg for the king's mercy, a mercy Edward envisioned as a swift beheading rather than the traditional, more agonizing death by fire reserved for heretics of her conviction. These chilling documents, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a mind that had journeyed far beyond normal political rivalry into the desolate territory of genuine sociopathic hatred, all cloaked in the righteous language of religious purity. His treatment of his other half-sister Elizabeth was more complex but equally devoid of genuine warmth. While he generally approved of her ostensible Protestant beliefs, though he remained somewhat suspicious of her pragmatism, he viewed Elizabeth primarily as a useful, if somewhat unpredictable pawn in his grand religious and political chessboard. He coolly planned to use Elizabeth's eventual marriage as a strategic tool to cement Protestant alliances with continental powers, treating her future happiness, her personal desires, as utterly irrelevant when weighed against the potential advantages her union might bring to his divinely ordained cause. Even his relatively more positive feelings toward Elizabeth were filtered through the distorting lens of his religious obsessions, making it abundantly clear that her value to him was purely instrumental, contingent on her continued adherence to his brand of Protestantism. This profound inability to form normal, affectionate family relationships extended to his broader court as well. Edward treated his nobles, his advisors, even his long-serving personal attendants, not as individuals with their own intrinsic worth, hopes and fears, but as interchangeable pieces to be moved, manipulated, or, if necessary, sacrificed according to the dictates of his religious and political strategies. Those who had served him faithfully for years, who had pandered to his every whim, could find themselves abruptly discarded, disgraced, or even facing charges of treason if they showed the slightest hesitation, the faintest flicker of insufficient enthusiasm for his increasingly extreme policies. Loyalty to Edward VI meant absolute unquestioning submission to his vision of a purified Protestant England. There was no room for personal conscience, for moral qualms, or for any loyalty that might supersede fealty to his divine will. Then, in the early months of 1553, a new, ominous shadow fell across the young king's increasingly tyrannical reign. Edward, now 15 years old, began to show undeniable signs of serious illness. A persistent cough, initially dismissed as a winter ailment, worsened dramatically. Fevers racked his young body, and a noticeable, alarming wasting began. As his physical strength waned, his behavior became even more erratic, his religious zeal more fervent, his cruelty more pronounced. Rather than softening in the face of his own mortality, or perhaps contemplating the state of his soul, the teenage king became utterly consumed with a desperate, almost maniacal obsession, ensuring that his Protestant reforms, his life's work, would survive his impending death. He knew with a certainty that filled him with cold dread that Mary's accession would mean the immediate and complete restoration of Catholicism. This knowledge, the terrifying prospect of his entire religious edifice being dismantled by his hated Catholic sister, drove him to increasingly desperate and ultimately monstrous measures. The possibility of his life's work being undone, of England being plunged back into popish darkness, filled Edward with a rage that bordered on madness, leading him to contemplate and actively plan solutions that would have undoubtedly horrified even his own notoriously ruthless father. Henry VIII, the dying boy, was determined to take his kingdom with him into his vision of righteous purity, even if it meant tearing it apart in the process. The young king's declining health, rather than moderating his extremism, seemed to pour fuel on the already raging fire of his religious fervor. As Edward VI grew physically weaker, his spiritual obsessions burned with an almost preternatural intensity, as if he were desperately trying to compress a lifetime of Protestant purification into his rapidly dwindling months. Court physicians, a bewildered and increasingly helpless group, reported that the king's illness, a devastating combination that modern medical historians believe was likely a virulent form of tuberculosis, possibly complicated by a secondary infection like bronchopneumonia, and perhaps even exacerbated by the aggressive arsenic-laced treatments of the era, was frequently accompanied by periods of fevered, almost delirious preaching. During these episodes, he would deliver rambling, terrifying sermons to his attendants, his voice, though weakened, still laced with conviction, expounding on the absolute necessity of eliminating every vestige of Catholic influence from England, even if it meant, as he reportedly shrieked during one such paroxysm, the righteous slaughter of every papist in the land, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant. These disturbing rants were initially dismissed by some as the ravings of a fever-addled mind, but Edward's lucid moments, which became rarer but no less intense, revealed that his extreme pronouncements reflected deeply held, genuine intentions rather than mere sickness-induced delusions. His body was failing, but his will, bent on a terrifying vision of religious purity, remained terrifyingly intact. With the spectre of death looming and the terrifying prospect of Mary's Catholic succession becoming ever more real, Edward began to meet in secret with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and a small cabal of the most radical Protestant loyalists. Together, they plotted a desperate and audacious coup, a plan breathtaking in its illegality and its inherent cruelty. The devise for the succession, as Edward termed his amended will, sought to entirely bypass both his half-sisters. Mary for her Catholicism, Elizabeth for her perceived political unreliability, and the lingering stain of her mother's alleged treason, in favor of his distant cousin, the staunchly Protestant Lady Jane Grey. Jane, a devout and learned young woman, was conveniently married to Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley, making the political motivations behind the scheme transparent to all but the most willfully blind. The conspiracy that emerged from these furtive, feverish meetings was not merely a political maneuver, it was a blueprint for tyranny. It involved detailed plans for the swift arrest and probable execution of both Mary and Elizabeth should they resist. It envisioned the installation of a puppet regime, wholly controlled by Northumberland and his extremist faction, with the 16-year-old Jane as a figurehead. The 15-year-old king, despite his profound physical weakness, his body increasingly racked with coughing fits that left him gasping for breath, threw himself into these planning sessions with a manic energy that both amazed and deeply frightened his co-conspirators. He saw it as his final, sacred duty. The details of Edward's final plot, meticulously recorded in his own increasingly shaky handwriting, revealed the full, horrifying extent of his transformation from a cherished royal child into a would-be despot. Working closely with Northumberland, Edward drafted lists of prominent Catholic nobles and gentry to be arrested and neutralized immediately upon his death. He outlined provisions for the mass seizure of all remaining Catholic properties, the funds from which would be used to further the Protestant cause and reward loyal supporters. He even began to sketch out the framework for a permanent religious police force, an internal security service with sweeping powers to monitor every aspect of English life, ensuring adherence to his rigid brand of Protestantism. His personal involvement in planning these potential atrocities was both detailed and disturbingly enthusiastic. The dying king, propped up on pillows, his breath shallow and ragged, spent his final, pain-filled weeks drafting these manifestos of persecution. Page after page was filled with his spidery script, outlining his vision for a Protestant utopia built upon a foundation of religious genocide. The boy, who had once seemed like an innocent, albeit intellectually precocious victim of political and religious manipulation, revealed himself in these last days to be the ideological driving force behind a conspiracy that, had it succeeded, might have made the Spanish Inquisition seem merciful by comparison. His legacy was to be one of absolute conformity, enforced by terror, but Edward's illness, the one force he could not master, held a cruel, almost poetically just twist that seemed like a macabre divine retribution for the horrors he was planning. As his condition worsened, the treatments administered by his increasingly desperate physicians likely hastened his agonizing decline. While tuberculosis was almost certainly the primary culprit, contemporary accounts describe symptoms strikingly consistent with chronic poisoning, greenish skin, hair loss, putrefying flesh, and an unbearable stench. It's highly probable that the heavy metals, including arsenic and mercury, common in Tudor-era remedies, were slowly, agonizingly destroying his already ravaged body. The irony was not lost on some astute, if terrified, contemporary observers. The king who had sought to poison his kingdom with religious hatred was himself being consumed, quite literally, by the poisons administered by those attempting to save his life. As these toxins ravaged his system, Edward experienced terrifying hallucinations and periods of profound madness, which his more fanatical attendants interpreted as divine visions or spiritual battles against demonic forces. The boy who had shown so little mercy to others spent his final weeks in unremitting agony, his frail body racked with excruciating pain as he slowly, visibly wasted away. Court physicians, in their grim daily reports, noted that Edward's profound suffering seemed only to intensify his religious fervor, as if his physical torment was perversely feeding his mental obsessions rather than leading to any spiritual solace or repentance. The precise manner of Edward's death was particularly horrifying for those few who witnessed its final stages. Chroniclers and physicians recorded that weeks before his actual demise, the young king's body began to emit a foul, putrid odor so strong that it permeated his chambers, despite the constant burning of incense and fragrant herbs. His skin, stretched taut over his emaciated frame, reportedly took on a ghastly greenish-black tint, indicative of severe systemic poisoning and tissue necrosis. His hair and fingernails began to fall out in clumps. He suffered from violent, uncontrollable convulsions that left him temporarily paralyzed and screaming in a mixture of terror and agony. The boy who had once been lauded as one of the most beautiful and promising of Henry VIII's children, the pearl of the realm, became a grotesque, almost unrecognizable shadow of his former self, his body seemingly rebelling in the most visceral way against the poisons that were inexorably claiming him. Perhaps most disturbing of all, through much of this horrific decline, the king remained terrifyingly lucid, acutely aware of his own decay and the excruciating pain it entailed. His final days were spent alternating between shrill screams of physical agony and fevered, hate-filled rants about Protestant martyrs, the perfidy of papists, and the urgent need to secure Lady Jane Grey's succession. His last coherent conversations were not of reconciliation, forgiveness, or love for his family. They were filled with bitter regret that he would not live to see the full implementation of his planned purification of England. The dying king, his voice a hoarse whisper, begged Northumberland and his other co-conspirators to proceed with their treasonous plot, even without him, promising them that God would undoubtedly reward their faithfulness in establishing his Protestant paradise. His final hours were a grotesque parody of a pious Christian deathbed scene. Instead of seeking forgiveness for his sins or expressing love for those around him, Edward spent his last ragged breaths cursing his Catholic sister Mary, reviling her as God's enemy, and praying desperately for God to preserve Protestant England from what he termed her wicked and idolatrous designs. Witnesses reported that his very final words were not of peace, but of seething, impotent hatred, a chillingly fitting end to a life that had been so utterly consumed by religious fanaticism and political extremism. When Edward VI finally died on July 6, 1553, just shy of his 16th birthday, the relief among many of his courtiers, though masked by obligatory displays of grief, was palpable. The boy king, who had been hailed at his birth as England's salvation, had instead become its potential nightmare, and his death, however horrific, offered the only escape from his increasingly extreme and divisive policies that were driving the kingdom towards the precipice of civil war. Even his most devoted Protestant supporters, in the privacy of their thoughts, may have acknowledged that Edward's early death, while a blow to their cause, might ultimately have been a grim mercy for England. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed just how utterly his carefully, even fanatically, laid plans had been built upon the fragile foundation of his personal authority and driving will. Without the king's obsessive, almost demonic energy behind the conspiracy to alter the succession, it crumbled with astonishing rapidity. Northumberland's attempt to proclaim Lady Jane Grey Queen was met not with popular acclaim, but with widespread apathy and growing opposition. Moderate Protestants, horrified by the naked ambition of Northumberland and the sheer extremism of the plot Edward had championed, abandoned what they now recognized as a dangerous and illegal power grab. Lady Jane Grey, the innocent nine-day queen, found herself virtually friendless, a pawn in a game she never wished to play. Mary Tudor's journey to London, by contrast, became a triumphal procession, supported not just by jubilant Catholics, but by a significant number of moderate Protestants who were profoundly relieved by the collapse of Edward's extremist agenda. They saw in Mary, despite her Catholicism, a lawful successor and a preferable alternative to the continued rule of Protestant fanatics who had shown themselves willing to tear the kingdom apart. The boy king, who had dreamed of being immortalized as England's greatest Protestant champion, had instead, through his very intolerance and cruelty, ensured that his reign would be primarily remembered for its harshness, its puritanical zeal, and the profound sense of relief that accompanied his demise. Modern historians re-examining Edward VI's reign through contemporary documents, court records, and his own chillingly detailed journals have painted a picture far darker and more complex than the traditional narrative of a sickly, well-meaning boy manipulated by ambitious older men. What emerges is a portrait of a young man who was not merely a puppet, but an active and enthusiastic participant in persecution. A monarch who showed disturbing signs of deriving personal satisfaction from the suffering of others. Edward's meticulous personal involvement in planning executions, his dispassionate recording of torture methods, and his venomous hatred for those who opposed his religious views suggest that for 6 years, England was ruled by a mind that, if not fully sociopathic, was certainly exhibiting many of its terrifying hallmarks, all amplified by the intoxicating drug of unlimited power. The transformation of Edward from the golden boy of Henry VIII as hopes into a figure capable of such cold-blooded cruelty offers a disturbing insight into the profoundly corrupting nature of absolute power, especially when combined with ideological certainty and wielded by a mind too young and too isolated to grasp the human consequences. Unlike adult rulers, who might at least retain some capacity for empathy born of experience or be constrained by complex political calculations, Edward's complete isolation from normal human relationships, his unwavering belief in his own divine authority, and his relentless indoctrination created a perfect storm of intellectual precocity and emotional immaturity. The boy who had never been consistently told no, who believed that opposition to his will was literally sinful, became capable of atrocities that shocked even the violent and often brutal Tudor age. Contemporary accounts subtly suggest that, as Edward's reign progressed, his own courtiers became increasingly frightened by their young king's volatile behavior and his inflexible, almost inhuman zeal. Yet they felt largely powerless to restrain him. The very doctrine of the divine right of kings, which Henry VIII had used to legitimize his break with Rome, and which Edward's tutors had instilled in him so thoroughly, now served to make any opposition to the young king's will tantamount to blasphemy. Even his closest advisers found themselves unable or unwilling to moderate his increasingly extreme policies. The boy king had, in effect, created a system where his slightest whim, if couched in the language of religious imperative, became law, and his growing taste for cruelty and control had no effective check except, ultimately, his own mortality. Perhaps the most chilling question of all is what might have happened if Edward VI had lived to reach full adulthood, if his already robust fanaticism had been allowed to mature alongside his intellect and his royal authority. His detailed plans for a Protestant England, as glimpsed in his Devise and other writings, included the establishment of a permanent religious police force, the complete eradication of the Catholic nobility, and the creation of a pervasive surveillance state designed to monitor and control every aspect of his subjects' public and private lives. The teenager who died in agony in 1553 had already begun implementing these policies on a smaller, experimental scale. There is every terrifying reason to believe that a mature, healthy Edward VI would have forged one of history's most oppressive and ideologically rigid regimes. The legacy of Edward VI serves as a stark and enduring reminder that evil, or at least profound cruelty, can emerge from the most ostensibly innocent and privileged of sources, and that even intentions perceived as good or godly can be catastrophically corrupted by the intoxicating cocktail of unlimited power and unshakable religious fanaticism. The boy king, who fervently believed he was saving England's soul, came perilously close to destroying its body politic, and his premature, agonizing death may indeed have been the greatest, albeit unintentional, mercy his short and terrible reign could have offered his beleaguered subjects. His story stands as a potent and disturbing warning about the inherent dangers of combining absolute authority with ideological certainty, especially when placed in the hands of someone too young, too isolated, and too indoctrinated to comprehend the profound and devastating human consequences of their actions. Edward's story also illuminates the dangerous, often volatile intersection of youth, power, and ideology. While adult tyrants might be, to some extent, restrained by political pragmatism, personal relationships, or a lifetime of accumulated experience, Edward's complete intellectual isolation, his relentless academic cocooning, and his absolute, unshakable belief in his own divinely sanctioned righteousness made him capable of contemplating and even meticulously planning atrocities that even hardened political operators of his era found shocking. The child who should have been playing with hoops and tops was instead drafting execution lists and designing systems for religious purges, treating human lives as expendable ciphers in his grand, terrifying quest for theological purity. His reign is a chilling case study in how education, when stripped of humanizing influences and focused solely on ideological indoctrination, can create not a wise ruler, but a moral monster. Someone who could brilliantly construct intricate theological justifications for unimaginable cruelty, but who had never truly learned the foundational lessons of basic human empathy. In the end, Edward VI's brief, tragic, and terrifying reign stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of power corrupting innocence, or perhaps revealing a darkness that lay dormant. The boy who began as Henry VIII's most cherished heir, England's brightest hope, ended as a figure so frightening, so consumed by his own righteous hatreds, that his own death, however grotesque, was met with a profound, if unspoken, sigh of relief by the very subjects he claimed to rule for God. His transformation from a protected, adulated child into a would-be tyrant reveals uncomfortable, timeless truths about the fragility of human nature, the seductive allure of absolute certainty, and the particular chilling dangers posed by those who believe, with unwavering conviction, that their cruelty serves a higher, holier purpose.